The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of the Metro City Police Department. Officer James sat at his desk, nursing his third cup of black coffee while reviewing the certification paperwork for his K-9 partner, Duke. It was Tuesday, October 15th, a date that would become etched into his memory forever, though he had no idea at that moment just how significant this ordinary morning would turn out to be. Had been Duke's handler for exactly 3 years, 2 months and 14 days. He knew this precise timeline because he'd marked it on his calendar. Duke wasn't just a working partner, too, he was family. The 4-year-old German Shepherd had an impeccable record with the department, 47 successful apprehensions, 23 drug busts, and 1 life-saving rescue of a missing child. Duke's photograph hung on the wall of the K-9 unit break room, flanked by commendations and service awards. Other officers joked that treated the dog better than most people treated their spouses, and they weren't entirely wrong. This particular morning had started like countless others. Arrived at the precinct at 6:47 a.m., 15 minutes before his shift officially began, a habit ingrained after years of military service. He'd gone through his pre-shift checklist methodically, uniform pressed, badge polished, weapon secured, and K-9 unit inspection complete. Duke's cage had been meticulously cleaned the night before, his food and water bowls fresh, and his favorite rope toy, the one with the knotted ends, positioned in the corner where the dog liked to rest his head during downtime. At 8:15 a.m., received the notification he'd been anticipating. Duke's annual certification was due. Every K-9 in the department had to undergo rigorous annual testing to maintain their operational status. It wasn't just bureaucracy, it was essential. These dogs were valuable members of the force, and their skills had to be validated by certified trainers at the regional training facility, located 45 minutes away in Highland County. The regional facility was state-of-the-art and had made this drive dozens of times. He knew the route by heart. Highway 7 East merge onto Interstate 405, exit at Highland Boulevard, then 5 miles north to the sprawling facility surrounded by training grounds and obstacle courses. The drive was routine, almost meditative. Usually used the time to think about department matters, his personal life, or, if he was being honest with himself, to mentally prepare Duke for the testing ahead. Had explained the certification to Duke 1,000 times, even though the dog obviously didn't understand his words. "It's just a formality, buddy," he'd say, rubbing behind Duke's ears. "You're the best K-9 we've got. They're just going to verify what I already know." Duke would respond by nudging his hand, seeking more scratches, his tail wagging with unconditional trust. That trust was everything, too. It represented a bond built on respect, care, and mutual commitment. At 9:00 a.m., completed his paperwork and headed to the garage where the K-9 transport vehicle was parked. The van was painted white with large blue lettering that read Metro City Police Department K-9 Unit. The rear section was equipped with a specialized cage, a reinforced structure designed for transporting working dogs safely and securely. The cage had been installed 5 years ago and had transported dozens of dogs over the years. It was a standard piece of equipment, state-approved and regularly inspected. Led Duke from the holding area to the van. The dog walked with the proud gait of a highly trained animal, his movements deliberate and controlled. Duke had learned that the van meant work, either active patrol or training exercises. The dog's ears perked forward, his eyes bright with anticipation. Opened the cage door and Duke jumped inside with practiced ease, settling onto the cushioned mat that lined the floor. Secured the latches, or so he thought. The cage door had a dual latch system, one electronic, one manual. That morning, engaged the electronic latch with his, and the manual latch appeared to click into place. Had done this hundreds of times. His hands were on autopilot. He didn't notice, and how could he have that the manual latch was already compromised? The mechanism had been slowly deteriorating for months, its metal fibers weakening from repeated use. 3 months ago, the cage had been flagged for maintenance during a routine inspection. A work order had been filed, but budget constraints and staffing shortages had delayed the repair. It remained on a list, buried among dozens of other maintenance requests, each one deemed non-critical. Climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The van rumbled to life with a familiar diesel sound. Through his mirror, could see Duke settling into his characteristic traveling position, front paws stretched out, head resting on his paws, alert but comfortable. "Ready for your big day," called back to his partner. Duke's tail thumped twice against the cage's metal floor, his standard response. The drive began smoothly. Merged into traffic on Highway 7, his mind already running through the certification tests that Duke would face, tracking exercises, apprehension drills, scent detection scenarios. Duke would ace them all. He always did. Allowed himself a small smile, feeling the familiar warmth of pride in his partner's capabilities. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of October day that reminded you why you loved living in this part of the country. The trees lining the highway were beginning to turn colors, their leaves shifting from green to gold and crimson. Leaves fell intermittently across the road, and windshield wipers brushed them aside automatically. Everything felt peaceful and routine. At 9:47 a.m., exactly as he'd calculated, turned onto Maple Street, the tree-lined residential avenue that would lead him toward the interstate entrance. This street was familiar to him. He'd driven it hundreds of times. It was generally quiet, lined with modest homes set back from the road, their gardens neat and well-maintained. A few residents were out doing their morning routines, walking dogs, retrieving newspapers, watering plants. And then it happened. The van hit a pothole, not unusual for Maple Street, which had been marked for road repair for months. It wasn't a massive hole, nothing that would normally cause concern. But the timing was catastrophic. The impact jarred the van upward and then down, creating a violent jolt that reverberated through the entire vehicle. In that split second, the already compromised manual latch on Duke's cage, the one that should have been replaced months ago, finally gave way completely. The metal mechanisms that had been weakening for months simply surrendered to the force of the impact. The cage door swung open with a terrible metallic shriek. In the mirror, caught the flash of movement before his mind could fully process what was happening. Duke, disoriented by the sudden opening of his secure enclosure and startled by the violent jolt, reacted on pure instinct. The dog scrambled to his feet and bolted forward. There was a sound like thunder, the sound of 75 pounds of muscular canine launching himself out of the cage. "Duke!" shouted, slamming on the brakes, but it was too late. Through his side mirror, watched in horror as his partner, his best friend, his trusted companion, leaped from the moving vehicle and hit the ground running. The dog's powerful legs propelled him forward in pure panic, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. The van screeched to a halt, tires squealing against the asphalt. Officer James' hands trembled as he grabbed his radio microphone, his professional composure shattering like glass. For 3 years, he had maintained unwavering control in high-pressure situations, responding to armed robberies, domestic disturbances, and dangerous pursuits with calm precision. But this was different. This was Duke. This was personal. "Dispatch, this is Unit 23, his voice cracked slightly as he spoke into the radio. K9 escaped vehicle. Current location, Maple Street near intersection. German Shepherd male, 4 years old. Unit designation, Duke. Repeat, K9 has escaped." The dispatch center fell silent for a moment, a pause that felt like an eternity. Then came the response from dispatcher Maria Santos, her voice sharp and alert. "Copy that, Unit 23. K9 escaped on Maple Street. Stand by for protocol activation." What didn't realize in that moment was that his transmission had just triggered a series of emergency protocols that would transform the quiet suburban morning into something resembling a small-scale military operation. The moment the words "K9 escaped" were broadcast across the police frequency, every officer within a 15-mile radius felt a jolt of urgency surge through their bodies. A loose police dog wasn't just a lost pet. It was a potential threat to public safety, and the department's procedures reflected that reality. Within seconds, Dispatcher Santos began coordinating the response. Her fingers flew across her keyboard, initiating automated alerts. All units in the Maple Street vicinity be advised. K9 Unit 23 has reported an escaped German Shepherd police dog. Armed and dangerous protocol in effect. Repeat, armed and dangerous protocol in effect. All citizens in the area should proceed indoors and secure doors and windows. Do not approach the animal. I repeat, do not approach the animal. The dog is trained to apprehend and may respond unpredictably. The dispatch center's digital alerts began popping up on mobile data terminals in patrol cars throughout the city. Officers who had been handling routine traffic stops, responding to minor calls, or completing paperwork suddenly found their screens flashing with urgent red notifications. Some officers were just 3 blocks away from Maple Street. Within moments, they were activating their light bars and sirens, redirecting their vehicles toward the scene. Remained in his stationary van, his eyes scanning the residential street frantically. Duke had disappeared around the corner, heading toward the residential area beyond the tree line. The dog was moving purely on instinct now, frightened, disoriented, and separated from everything familiar. New Duke's training was excellent, but training meant nothing when an animal was in full panic mode. Training was designed for controlled scenarios, not for a terrified dog loose in an unfamiliar suburban neighborhood. The first patrol car arrived at the scene within 90 seconds. Officer Williams pulled up behind his van, his hand already moving to his duty belt. Williams was a 10-year veteran with a reputation for quick decision-making, but even he looked shaken. A loose police dog was every officer's nightmare scenario. The potential for tragedy was real and multifaceted. The dog could bite a civilian. A civilian could attack the dog out of fear. An officer might make a split-second decision they'd regret for the rest of their lives. "Where did he go?" Williams called out, pointing in the direction Duke had run. "That way." He was panicked. "I've never seen him like this," replied, his voice still unsteady. The guilt was already beginning to set in, a heavy weight pressing against his chest. This was his responsibility. Duke was his partner, his charge, his trust to maintain. And somehow, on what was supposed to be a routine transportation, he had failed. Within 3 minutes, 4 additional patrol cars had converged on the Maple Street area. Officers began fanning out, moving cautiously through the residential neighborhood, their hands on their weapons, their eyes scanning every hedge, every alleyway, every parked car. The coordinated search had begun, but it was complicated by several factors. First, they didn't want to spook Duke further. Second, they didn't want to cause panic among the residents. Third, and most importantly, they needed to find the dog quickly before something tragic happened. The sirens wailed continuously now, their electronic chorus piercing the morning air. What had been a peaceful suburban morning transformed instantly into something chaotic and frightening. Residents who had been casually going about their business suddenly found themselves in an emergency situation. The emergency alert system that was integrated with the police dispatch began sending notifications to residents' phones. Emergency alert. Escaped police K9 in your area. Proceed indoors immediately. Do not approach the animal. Mrs., who had been opening her boutique on Maple Street, abandoned her keys in the lock and hurried back inside, her heart racing. She had lived in this neighborhood for 18 years and had never experienced anything like this. She locked the glass doors and herded the few early morning customers toward the back of the store. Through the windows, she could see patrol cars racing past, their lights flashing alternately red and blue, casting eerie colored shadows across the storefronts. 3 blocks away, at Monroe Elementary School, Principal David Henderson had just arrived for work. When his phone buzzed with the emergency alert, he immediately initiated the school's lockdown procedures. Teachers ushered arriving students inside and locked the classroom doors. Parents who were driving their children to school saw the police vehicles and the flashing lights and made the decision to turn around and head home instead. The entire neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. The search continued with increasing intensity. Officers called out Duke's name, their voices carrying across fenced yards and through residential streets. "Duke! Here, Duke!" they shouted, but their voices carried a tension that made the situation feel more like a hunt than a rescue. Some residents, hearing the commotion, peered cautiously out their windows. Others called 911 to report a large dog in someone's backyard, a moving shadow near the park, a dark figure disappearing into the woods near the creek. Each call sent officers rushing to new locations. The police department's resources were becoming stretched thin. A situation that had started as a simple escaped dog was beginning to feel like a community-wide emergency. The dispatch center's frequency crackled continuously with updates, requests for backup, and coordinates of potential. Some of these reports were accurate. Others were false alarms caused by frightened residents misidentifying neighborhood dogs or shadows. Officer, meanwhile, had abandoned his van and was searching on foot, his voice hoarse from calling Duke's name. Other officers kept their distance from him, understanding that he needed to be the one to locate his partner. Knew Duke's patterns, understood his psychology, could predict his movements in ways that other officers couldn't, but was also emotionally compromised, his judgment clouded by guilt and fear. 30 minutes after Duke's escape, the police department had mobilized every available resource. The quiet suburb had become a scene of controlled urgency, sirens wailing, officers moving strategically through neighborhoods, residents locked in their homes, the entire community transformed by the presence of danger. And through it all, Duke, trained, valuable, beloved Duke, was running blindly through an unfamiliar landscape, his mind spinning with confusion and fear, with no understanding of why everything had suddenly changed so dramatically. The question that hung in the air was simple but urgent. Where was Duke, and what would happen when they found him? Walter had always been an early riser. At 81 years old, he had long since stopped fighting his internal clock. His body simply didn't require the 8 hours of sleep it once had. Instead, he would wake at 5:30 a.m., make himself a strong cup of black coffee in the kitchen, and sit on his front porch to watch the sun climb over the horizon. It was a ritual he had maintained for nearly 40 years, ever since his wife had passed away. These quiet morning moments had become sacred to him, a time when the world was still sleeping, when the air felt fresh and full of possibility, when he could think without interruption. This particular Tuesday morning was no different. Walter had risen before dawn, dressed in his usual uniform of khaki pants and a faded blue button-down shirt, and settled into the wicker chair on his front porch with his coffee mug held in both hands. The morning was crisp, the kind of October morning that reminded him of his days in the military, clear-headed and cool, with just enough bite in the air to make you feel alive. Walter's life had been defined by service. He had joined the Army at 19, fresh out of high school, back in 1962, when the Vietnam War was beginning to escalate. He had served for 6 years, and for the last 4 of those years, he had been a military dog handler. That experience had shaped him in ways that continued to influence his life more than 5 decades later. He had trained dozens of dogs, had relied on them in situations where human lives hung in the balance, and had learned to communicate with them in a language that transcended words. Those dogs, particularly his primary partner, a German shepherd named Rex, had saved his life more times than he could count. They had detected enemy movements, warned of hidden dangers, and provided companionship in moments when the horrors of war threatened to consume his mind entirely. When Walter had left the military, he had carried those dogs with him in his heart, in his memories, and in the way he moved through the world. Since retirement, Walter had channeled his love for dogs into his garden and into his relationships with the neighborhood animals. He had never owned a dog himself. His small house and his advanced age had seemed like practical obstacles, but he always had a kind word and a treat for the dogs in the neighborhood. The local kids knew him as Mr. Walter, or sometimes just the Dog Man. He was the sort of person who remembered which dogs preferred cheese and which preferred peanut butter, who knew all their names and their personalities. At 9:00 a.m. that morning, Walter had moved from his porch to his front garden. His roses were his pride and joy. He had cultivated them for nearly 2 decades, carefully pruning them each spring, nurturing them through droughts and harsh winters. The current blooms were stunning, deep reds, soft pinks, and vibrant yellows that seemed to glow in the autumn sunlight. Walter held his watering can, an old ceramic vessel with a long spout that had belonged to his mother, and moved methodically through the garden beds, providing each rose with just the right amount of water. The neighborhood was quiet that morning in a way that felt normal and peaceful. Most people had already left for work or were occupied with indoor tasks. The street was lined with large oak and maple trees, their leaves beginning to turn color. The houses were set back from the road with generous yards between them, giving the neighborhood a sense of spaciousness and privacy that Walter had always appreciated. He was focused on a particularly stubborn yellow rose that had been struggling with powdery mildew when he first noticed the sirens in the distance. Walter paused, his watering can held midair, and listened. The sirens seemed to be getting closer, their electronic wail growing louder with each passing second. This wasn't unusual for a Tuesday morning. Emergency vehicles passed through the neighborhood occasionally, but something about the persistence and intensity of these sirens caught Walter's attention. He lowered his watering can and stood upright, his aging knees creaking slightly with the motion. His weathered face, lined with the creases of 8 decades of living, turned toward the direction of the sound. His sharp blue eyes that had lost some of their sharpness over the years but retained an intensity of perception, scanned the street. The sirens grew louder, and then he heard them, voices shouting, car doors slamming, the crackling of police radios. Walter's military training kicked in automatically, his observational skills sharpening. Something was happening, something significant enough to warrant multiple emergency vehicles and coordinated police activity. His mind ran through possibilities: an accident, a crime, a medical emergency. He continued watering his roses, but his attention remained partially focused on the activity in the neighborhood. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sound seemed to move away from his immediate area. The sirens receded slightly, the voices grew more distant. Walter relaxed minutely, assuming whatever emergency had occurred was being handled by the authorities. He returned to his rose garden, but his mind remained partially occupied with wondering what had happened. It was perhaps 15 minutes later when Walter first noticed something unusual. The sound of rapid footsteps, or rather, rapid paw steps, on the sidewalk near his property. Walter looked up from his watering, and what he saw made his entire body go very still. A large German shepherd rounded the corner of his property, running at full speed. The dog's coat was sleek and black and tan, the coloring distinctive and deliberate. But what caught Walter's attention most acutely was the dog's demeanor. This was not a dog out for a casual run. This was not a dog playing freely in a neighborhood. This was a dog in a state of panic, his eyes wide, his breathing rapid and desperate, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. Walter's mind immediately recognized what his eyes were seeing. This was a trained dog. The way the animal moved, the posture, the alert positioning of the ears, all of it spoke of professional training. And the color pattern, the size, the build, Walter's decades-old knowledge surfaced. This was a police dog, and this police dog was terrified. Most people would have reacted with fear. Most people would have run. Walter had heard the sirens. He understood that this escaped animal was being pursued. The logical response would have been to hurry inside, to lock the doors, to follow the implicit instruction to get to safety. But Walter had not survived 60 years since his military service by making logical decisions based on fear. He had survived by trusting his instincts, by understanding animals on a deeper level, by recognizing panic and responding to it with calm presence. Walter set down his watering can carefully on the garden edge. He straightened slowly, his joints protesting slightly. And as the German shepherd ran directly toward him, as the dog's panicked eyes met his calm gaze, Walter did something remarkable. He smiled. Walter's smile was not one of amusement or mockery. It was the smile of a man who understood the fundamental language of fear and recognition. It was the smile of someone who had spent decades communicating with frightened, disoriented animals in situations far more dire than a suburban morning. His weathered face, creased with age and wisdom, conveyed a message that transcended the barrier between species. I understand. You are safe here. The German shepherd Duke, though Walter did not yet know the name, was running at full speed toward him. The dog's powerful legs churned against the ground, his nails scraping against the asphalt and then against the grass of Walter's front lawn. The animal's breathing came in ragged, desperate gasps. His tongue hung from his mouth, not in the relaxed way of a happily panting dog, but in the frantic manner of a creature operating on pure survival instinct. But as Duke approached Walter, something changed in the dog's trajectory. Animals are extraordinarily perceptive creatures, far more sensitive to the subtle vibrations of human emotion and intention than most people realize. Duke sensed something in Walter's presence that contradicted the panic that had consumed his thoughts for the past 20 minutes. The dog skidded to a halt approximately 10 feet away from the elderly man, his muscles tense, his eyes locked on Walter's face. Walter did not move. This was crucial. This was the moment that separated understanding from reaction, wisdom from instinct. Many people, when confronted with a frightened animal, make the mistake of either advancing too quickly or retreating too far. Both actions communicate uncertainty and potential threat. Walter simply stood where he was, his watering can still held loosely in one hand, his body completely relaxed and open. "Easy, boy," Walter said, his voice pitched low and steady, the tone he had perfected over 6 decades. "Easy. You're scared, I know, but I'm not going to hurt you." The words themselves were less important than the tone that carried them. Walter's voice was like warm honey, smooth, flowing, consistent. It carried no inflection of threat or sudden changes that might startle the dog further. Duke's ears, which had been flattened back against his head in a defensive posture, twitched slightly at the sound of Walter's voice. The dog's breathing remained rapid, but his body language shifted infinitesimally. The rigid muscles began to relax just fractionally. The dog was listening. More than that, the dog was beginning to process information beyond the immediate fear that had driven him. Walter maintained his steady eye contact with Duke. He had learned long ago that direct eye contact with dogs was not, as some mistakenly believed, a challenge or a threat. Rather, it was a form of communication, a way of saying, "I see you, and I am present with you." Walter's blue eyes conveyed only calm acceptance and patient understanding. "It's all right," Walter continued, his voice maintaining its even cadence. "You're lost, and that's frightening, I understand that. But this," he gestured slightly to his yard, to his roses, to himself, "this is a safe place. There's no danger here." Walter slowly, with movements so deliberate they seemed almost choreographed, began to lower himself to the ground. He bent his knees and gradually descended into a kneeling position. This action was critical. By lowering his body, Walter was removing himself from a position of potential dominance. He was literally making himself smaller, less threatening, more on the dog's level. It was an ancient gesture of submission and trust, a way of saying wordlessly, "I am not a threat to you." The pain in Walter's knees as he knelt was sharp, the price of 8 decades of living, but he paid it no mind. His attention remained entirely focused on Duke, on reading the dog's body language, on maintaining the delicate bridge of trust he was attempting to construct. Duke's breathing began to slow slightly. The dog's head, which had been held high in a position of alert alarm, began to lower toward Walter. The animal took one tentative step forward, then paused. It was as if Duke was testing Walter's response, gauging whether the man represented genuine safety or simply a momentary illusion of it. "That's right," Walter said softly, his voice dropping even lower in volume and pitch. "Come here, buddy. You're going to be okay, just come here." Behind nearby windows, neighbors who had taken shelter indoors were watching in astonishment. Mrs. at her boutique, the family in their living room, old Mr. who had stayed home sick from work. They all peered cautiously through glass panes, unable to quite believe what they were witnessing. A terrified police dog, the subject of an emergency alert, was approaching an elderly man in a garden instead of attacking, instead of running away, instead of living up to every fearful assumption they had made about the situation. Duke took another step forward, then another. The dog's powerful frame, which had been rigid with terror moments before, began to relax with each forward movement. Walter's calm presence was working like a balm on the animal's frayed nerves. The dog was beginning to recognize, on some deep instinctual level, that here was a human who understood the language of fear, who knew how to speak to terror in a way that transformed it into trust. Walter extended his right hand slowly, palm upward, fingers slightly curved. This was not a gesture of dominance or command. This was an offering. This was Walter saying to Duke, "I am giving you access to my scent, my presence, my commitment to your safety." The gesture was humble and generous. Duke, now only 3 feet away from Walter, stretched his neck forward and sniffed the offered hand. His powerful nose worked, processing the scent of this stranger, analyzing it for threat or safety. What Duke's senses encountered was the smell of earth from the garden, of roses and water, of age and wisdom and countless dogs that this man had touched over the decades. It was a scent that meant something profound to the animal's instincts, though Duke had no conscious understanding of why. Walter's weathered fingers barely brushed against Duke's muzzle, the contact feather-light and non-threatening. "That's good boy," Walter whispered. "You're so brave. Just a scared boy who got separated from home. That happens. That's okay. I've got you now." In that moment, something profound shifted in Duke's psychological state. The dog's legs, which had been trembling with adrenaline and panic for the past 20 minutes, began to weaken. The animal pressed forward, and with a sound that was almost like a whimper, a sound that contained all of the dog's confusion and fear and longing for safety, Duke collapsed against Walter's chest. Walter's arms came up instinctively, enfolding the large dog, his weathered hand stroking the animal's back with a rhythm that was both soothing and deeply familiar. Walter's own breathing synchronized with Duke's frantic gasps, his heartbeat steady and strong against the dog's rapidly beating heart. For those long moments, as officer radios crackled in the distance and sirens continued to wail blocks away, there was only an old man and a scared dog, finding in each other's presence the antidote to terror. Duke's massive frame seemed to collapse into Walter's arms like a building surrendering to demolition. The dog's weight, 75 pounds of muscle and bone, pressed against the elderly man's body, but Walter didn't flinch. He had supported animals far larger and more aggressive than this frightened German shepherd. His arms, which at 81 years old were no longer as strong as they had been in his youth, managed to accommodate the dog's full weight with surprising ease born from decades of experience and muscle memory that never quite faded. Duke's breathing, which had been rapid and panicked, began to slow incrementally. Each exhale seemed to release another layer of the terror that had gripped him. The dog's body, which had been rigid with adrenaline and confusion, began to soften against Walter's embrace. It was as if every muscle fiber in Duke's body had been wound tight like an overwound spring, and Walter's presence was allowing that tension to gradually unwind. Walter continued his rhythmic stroking across Duke's back, his weathered hands moving with purpose and gentleness. His fingers found the places along the dog's spine and ribs where tension was held, and his touch seemed to dissolve that tension with each pass. Walter's own breathing had become slow and deliberate, a conscious effort to maintain the calm presence that was so essential in this moment. His heartbeat was steady, strong, reliable. Duke's heartbeat, which had been hammering against Walter's chest like a hummingbird's wings only moments before, began to synchronize with the old man's more measured rhythm. "That's right, buddy," Walter whispered into the dog's ear, his voice barely audible, meant only for Duke and the wind. "You're safe now. You're going to be okay. I know you're scared, but you're not alone anymore. I'm right here with you." The words themselves were simple, almost mundane, but the intention behind them was profound. Walter was speaking to something deeper than the dog's conscious mind. He was speaking to the animal's nervous system, to its survival instincts, to that ancient part of a dog's brain that recognized genuine safety and genuine threat. And what Duke's entire being understood in that moment was that this person, this gray-haired human who smelled of earth and patience, represented genuine safety. Duke's whimper had transformed into something softer, almost a sigh of relief. The dog's head, which had initially pressed against Walter's shoulder, now rested against the old man's chest, close to his heart. Duke's eyes, which had been wide with panic just moments before, began to close slowly. The dog's breathing continued to deepen, becoming more regular, more natural. Incredibly, impossibly, despite the sirens that still wailed in the distance, and the knowledge that he had escaped from his handler and his home, Duke appeared to be finding a sense of peace in Walter's arms. Walter's own eyes remained open, his attention entirely focused on the dog. He was aware, on some level, that this peaceful moment was temporary. He knew that soon the police would arrive. He understood that this brief respite was merely the eye of a storm that would soon resume. But for now, in this suspended moment, there was only the two of them, a dog finding shelter from fear, and an old man finding purpose in providing that shelter. Several blocks away, Officer James was continuing his frantic search through the residential neighborhood. His uniform was disheveled, his badge catching the sunlight as he ran from yard to yard, calling Duke's name with increasing desperation. Other officers were fanning out through the streets, their vehicle lights still flashing, creating an atmosphere of urgent emergency throughout the once peaceful suburb. Officer Williams, who had been searching 3 blocks to the east, was the first to receive the call from a resident. Mrs. at her boutique had worked up the courage to call 911 to report what she was witnessing, an elderly man in a garden with the escaped police dog. She had seen the emergency alerts, understood that the dog was supposed to be dangerous, but something about what she was witnessing, the absolute calm, the lack of any violence or struggle, suggested that perhaps the emergency was being resolved in the most unexpected of ways. Williams immediately radioed the information. "Dispatch, possible location on the K9, Maple Street near. Reporting citizen says the dog is with an elderly resident. No signs of struggle or violence." The dispatch center relayed the information, and within moments, multiple officers began converging on that location. Officer, hearing the coordinates, felt something like hope surge through his chest. It was a fragile hope, built on the assumption that Duke was alive and had not bitten or attacked anyone, but it was hope nonetheless. Reached the location first, approaching rapidly from the east. He turned the corner onto the residential street where Walter lived, and what he saw made him skid to a halt so abruptly that his shoes left small marks on the pavement. There, in the middle of a front garden surrounded by blooming roses, was an elderly man kneeling on the ground with Duke's massive frame wrapped against his body. Duke's eyes were closed. The dog's breathing was calm and steady, and most shockingly, the dog appeared to be in a state of complete peaceful surrender. His hand immediately went to his duty weapon, but he found himself unable to draw it. This scene, this impossible, beautiful scene, contradicted every protocol he had ever learned. His training had prepared him for violence, for aggression, for a dangerous situation requiring immediate intervention. But what he was witnessing was something entirely different. Officer Williams arrived moments later, his patrol car pulling up behind's van. Several other officers emerged from nearby streets, all converging on the location, all prepared for potential conflict. And then they too stopped, processing what their eyes were seeing. The escaped police dog, the animal that had triggered emergency alerts, mobilized dozens of officers, and transformed a quiet suburb into a scene of coordinated urgency, was lying peacefully in an old man's arms. The dog that was supposed to be dangerous was resting its head against a senior citizen's chest. The situation that was supposed to require tactical intervention was being resolved through nothing but human compassion and animal trust. Walter slowly became aware of the presence of the officers. He opened his eyes and looked directly at, and in that gaze there was no fear, no defensiveness, no sense of transgression. There was only calm acceptance and quiet understanding. "He's going to be all right," Walter said softly, his voice carrying easily across the garden. "He was just frightened. Sometimes that's all any of us need, to know that someone understands and that we're not alone." Officer, standing in his full police uniform with his hand still resting near his weapon, felt something shift in his understanding of this moment, this dog, and this situation. He slowly lowered his hand. Officer James moved forward slowly, his police training in conflict de-escalation guiding his movements. He approached Walter and Duke with the careful deliberation of someone approaching a delicate situation that could still potentially deteriorate. His boots made soft crunching sounds on the garden pathway, a gentle acoustic announcement of his presence. His hands were open and visible, showing no aggression or threat. His face, which had been twisted with anxiety and guilt just moments before, had transformed into an expression of wonder and gratitude. Walter looked up as the officer approached, his weathered face calm and patient. Duke remained completely still in Walter's arms, his body relaxed in a way that seemed physically impossible given the chaos of the past 30 minutes. The dog's breathing continued its steady, peaceful rhythm, and there was no indication that the animal even registered its approach. "Sir, thank you," began, his voice still slightly unsteady with emotion. He stopped several feet away from Walter, respecting the boundary of the elderly man's space. I'm not sure how you did that, but thank you. You may have prevented something terrible from happening." Walter smiled gently, his blue eyes assessing with the same intuitive accuracy he had applied to Duke. "He wasn't aggressive, son. He was just lost and scared. There's a difference, an important difference, between a dog that's dangerous and a dog that's frightened. Most people don't understand that distinction." As looked more closely at Walter, something in the man's bearing, his words, his manner of holding Duke all seemed to suggest a depth of knowledge about working dogs that went far beyond casual familiarity. There was something about Walter's demeanor, a calm professionalism wrapped in kindness, that spoke of real experience, significant experience with trained animals. "How did you know what to do?" asked, genuine curiosity replacing some of the anxiety in his voice. "Most people would have either run or tried to call animal control. You just knew exactly how to handle him." Walter carefully began to shift Duke's weight, preparing to hand the dog over to. The movement was slow and deliberate, designed to maintain the dog's peaceful state throughout the transfer. "I've been where your partner is," Walter said, his voice taking on a quality of reflection. "Not exactly, of course, but close enough. I was a military dog handler. Vietnam War. I trained and worked with dogs like this one for 6 years." His eyes widened slightly. He had served 4 years in the military himself, though in a different capacity. He understood the bond that formed between handlers and their animals, but he was hearing something in Walter's voice, a familiarity, a recognition, a depth of understanding that suggested Walter's experience ran even deeper than his own knowledge could fathom. Officer Williams, who had been standing several yards away maintaining a perimeter, moved closer, also drawn by the revelation of Walter's background. The other officers who had arrived at the scene stood in a loose circle around the garden, watching the scene unfold with the kind of attention typically reserved for something momentous. "You trained military K-9s?" asked, his tone shifting into something more respectful, more understanding. For how long? 4 years, Walter replied, successfully transferring Duke's weight to his arms. Duke stirred slightly as he moved from one human to another, but his eyes remained closed, his breathing undisturbed. I worked primarily with German shepherds. The dogs were incredible, smarter than most humans, braver than most humans, more loyal than most humans. I had a dog named Rex who saved my life more times than I can count. Carefully cradled Duke against his chest, feeling an almost overwhelming sense of relief and gratitude flood through him. But even as he held his partner, his attention remained focused on Walter. There was something important in this conversation, something that went beyond the immediate crisis. Rex repeated softly, "That must have been quite a partnership." "It was," Walter confirmed, and in those two simple words there existed an entire history, a history of danger and trust, of life and death, of bonds that transcended the conventional understanding of human-animal relationships. We were together for 4 years. When I left the military, I had to leave him behind. They wouldn't let me take him with me. Military dogs either went to new handlers or— Walter paused, his expression becoming distant for a moment, or they were retired. I never found out what happened to Rex. I was just a young man, and I didn't know how to fight the system. Understood the weight of that regret. He could hear it in Walter's voice, could see it in the way the old man's eyes looked into a distant past. That must have been hard. It was, Walter acknowledged. But I learned something from that experience. I learned that these animals, they're not just tools or equipment. They're beings with their own consciousness, their own fears, their own capacity for joy and suffering. Handlers forget that sometimes. They treat their partners like weapons instead of like companions. When you do that, something important is lost. The partnership becomes mechanical instead of genuine. Officer Williams, who had been listening to this exchange, stepped forward. "Mr. Is-it, what you did today, what you're saying about understanding these animals, that's not something most people have. That's expertise." Walter turned to acknowledge Williams with a nod. "I'm just an old man who spent enough time with dogs to understand how their minds work. Your officer here," Walter gestured to, "he clearly loves his dog. I could see that. The love was the important part. Duke responded to that love, even though the dog was separated from his handler. He responded to the principle of what your officer represents: loyalty, care, understanding." Felt something shift in his perspective as he listened to Walter speak. He had been trained in K9 handling, had studied protocols and procedures, had learned techniques and tactics. But what he was hearing from this elderly man was something that transcended technique. It was philosophy. It was wisdom. It was a fundamental understanding of the relationship between human and animal that seemed to touch something deeper than mere professional. "I'd like to learn more," heard himself say, "about what you're describing, about how you approach working with dogs." Walter smiled, and in that smile there was something like recognition. "Son, I think your dog just taught you the most important lesson already. But if you're interested, I wouldn't mind sharing what I know. These skills, this understanding, it shouldn't disappear just because the old guard gets older." Officer Williams exchanged a glance with. Both men seemed to understand that something significant was happening, something that transcended the immediate crisis. An opportunity had emerged, born from chaos and fear, that might lead to something meaningful and lasting. "Mr. Williams said formally, would you be willing to speak with our department about K9 handling methods, about what you did today? I think our handlers, all of them, could benefit from your perspective." Walter looked at Duke, now resting peacefully in his arms, and then back at the officers. "I'd be honored," he said simply. By 2:00 p.m. that same Tuesday afternoon, the story had already begun to spread beyond the immediate neighborhood. Officer Williams had filed his incident report, documenting the details of Duke's escape and Walter's extraordinary intervention. The report made its way up the chain of command at the Metro City Police Department, passing through various supervisory levels and eventually reaching the desk of Captain, who oversaw the K9 unit. Captain read the report with increasing fascination. What had started as a standard incident report, K9 escaped, recovered without injury, had evolved into something far more significant. The narrative described not a dangerous confrontation, but a profound moment of human connection and professional expertise applied in an unexpected context. By the time finished reading, she understood that this story deserved to be told, and it deserved to be told in a way that honored both the dog and the elderly man who had prevented potential tragedy. She made a phone call to the public information officer for the Metro City Police Department, suggesting that this story might warrant official media attention. The PIO, Sarah Mitchell, immediately understood the implications. In an era when police departments were frequently portrayed negatively in the media, here was a story that transcended divisiveness, a story about compassion, understanding, and a community member who had literally prevented a crisis through wisdom and kindness. By 3:00 p.m., the first news vans were arriving at Walter's quiet residential neighborhood. Reporters descended on Maple Street like a swarm of well-dressed locusts, all seeking to capture the details of this emerging human interest story. The local news stations had picked up on the department's official statement about the incident, and they understood immediately that this was exactly the kind of story their audiences craved, a break from the constant stream of negativity and conflict. Walter, still in his garden wearing his khaki pants and faded blue shirt, found himself suddenly surrounded by reporters holding microphones and photographers aiming cameras. The experience was disorienting for a man who had spent 81 years deliberately avoiding the spotlight. He had never sought attention or recognition. His entire adult life had been characterized by quiet service and unassuming dedication. And now, suddenly, he was being asked to explain his actions to strangers with cameras and recorders. The first reporter to approach him was Jessica from Channel 7 News. She was a seasoned journalist in her mid-40s, practiced in the art of drawing compelling narratives from ordinary moments. "Mister, can you tell us what was going through your mind when you saw the escaped police dog?" she asked, her microphone extended toward him, her cameraman framing the shot to capture both Walter and his garden in the background. Walter took a moment before responding, his mind processing the question and considering how best to answer it truthfully. "I was thinking that this was an animal in distress," he said slowly, his voice steady despite his unfamiliarity with media attention. "I wasn't thinking about danger or protocols or what I was supposed to do. I was just thinking about a scared living creature that needed help." The interview was brief but impactful. By 6:00 p.m., the story had made the lead position on Channel 7's evening news broadcast. The segment opened with footage of Walter in his garden, interspersed with official police statements and dramatic images of the police response earlier that morning. The headline read, "Local hero stops escaped police dog with kindness, not force." Within hours, the story had spread to other local news outlets. By 9:00 p.m., it was being covered by regional news stations. By Wednesday morning, it had gone national. News aggregators picked it up, social media users shared it with increasing frequency, and what had been a small neighborhood incident transformed into something approaching viral phenomenon. The story resonated because it represented something people desperately wanted to believe about humanity, that kindness could triumph over fear, that understanding could prevent violence, that sometimes the most powerful response to danger was compassion. The neighborhood itself transformed almost overnight. Wednesday morning brought a new kind of traffic to Maple Street, not police vehicles with flashing lights, but residents and visitors who wanted to see the location where this remarkable event had occurred. Some brought flowers or cards, which they left at the edge of Walter's property. Others simply stood on the sidewalk, looking at the garden where a man and a dog had found peace together. Mrs. at her boutique became a local celebrity of sorts, as reporters sought her out to get first-person accounts of what she had witnessed. The family, who had sheltered inside their home during the morning's chaos, received multiple interview requests. Even the principal at Monroe Elementary School found himself being asked about his perspective on how the community had handled the emergency. But perhaps most significantly, the police department itself received an overwhelming outpouring of positive feedback. Citizens called to praise Officer for his professionalism and restraint. They commended the entire K-9 unit for their coordinated response, and they extended their gratitude to Walter, who had prevented what could have been a tragic situation through wisdom and compassion. Captain received a call from the mayor's office. The mayor himself wanted to formally recognize Walter's actions. A ceremony was being planned for the following week, an official commendation from the city, media coverage, and formal acknowledgement of Walter's contribution to public safety. But perhaps most touching were the personal communications Walter received. Neighbors who had lived on his street for years but had never really spoken to him came to his door with baked goods and thank-you cards. Children from the neighborhood drew pictures of Walter and Duke, which were taped to the trees along Maple Street. A local restaurant owner brought Walter a gift certificate. The owner of a gardening supply store offered him a significant discount on Rose fertilizer and equipment. One particularly moving letter arrived from Officer James. Had taken time to write a handwritten note, something increasingly rare in the digital age, expressing his gratitude and his admiration for Walter's actions. "You didn't just save a dog," wrote. "You taught me something about my profession that no training program ever could. You reminded me why I do this work in the first place, because I care, genuinely care, about the lives I'm responsible for protecting." The incident also sparked broader conversations about K-9 handling practices within the police department. Captain received approval to create a training program focused on the philosophical and emotional aspects of K-9 work, not just the technical skills. And she had extended an official invitation to Walter to participate in developing and potentially teaching this new training module. What had started as a frightening morning in a quiet suburb had transformed into something entirely different. The emergency alerts had been replaced with stories of compassion. The fear had transformed into inspiration. And a quiet elderly man who had spent decades living modestly had suddenly become a symbol of something the entire community desperately needed to believe in. That understanding, patience, and kindness could transform even the most potentially dangerous situations into moments of unexpected grace and connection. The irony was not lost on Walter. He had never sought recognition or attention. He had simply responded authentically to a moment of need. And in doing so, he had inadvertently reminded an entire community of values they had perhaps begun to take for granted. 2 weeks after Duke's escape, the Metro City Police Department hosted an official commendation ceremony in the main auditorium of police headquarters. The event was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon, allowing maximum community attendance. The auditorium, which typically served for training sessions and department meetings, had been transformed for the occasion. Rows of chairs were arranged in a semicircle facing a small stage, adorned with the police department's seal and the city flag. Media representatives occupied the front section, their cameras and recording equipment ready to capture every moment. Officer James sat in the third row, Duke at his side. The dog wore his official service vest, and his bearing was proud and alert. But there was something different about Duke now, a calmness, a settledness that hadn't been present before his escape. Some might have attributed this to simple recovery from trauma, but knew better. The dog had experienced something profound during his encounter with Walter, something that had fundamentally altered his relationship with the world. Walter arrived 30 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. He wore a suit that he had purchased specifically for the occasion, a gray jacket and dark trousers that hung slightly loose on his aging frame. His wife had bought him his last suit in 1998, and he had rarely worn clothing so formal since her death. His daughter, Susan, who lived 3 hours away and had driven to the city for the occasion, walked beside him, her arm linked through his. Walter had too as well, but they were unable to attend due to school commitments. Captain greeted Walter warmly as he entered the auditorium. She shook his hand firmly, her gratitude evident in her bearing and her words. "Mister, thank you for being here. What you're about to experience, this ceremony, this recognition, it's genuinely deserved. You've done something extraordinary not just for our department but for our entire community." The ceremony began at 2:00 p.m. sharp. The auditorium had filled with police officers, community members, city officials, and media representatives. The mayor was in attendance, along with several city council members. The police chief, Robert, sat prominently on the stage, his uniform impeccable, his expression one of dignified pride. Police chief opened with remarks about the incident 2 weeks prior. He spoke about the potential for tragedy, about how situations involving escaped police dogs could easily escalate into dangerous confrontations. But then he pivoted to speak about Walter, about how one man's wisdom and compassion had transformed what could have been a crisis into a moment of inspiration. "We live in an age," Chief said from the podium, his voice carrying through the auditorium, "where it's easy to believe that force is the only answer to dangerous situations, that aggression is the only response to threat. But Mr. Walter reminded us, in a moment when all of us were responding with protocols and procedures, that sometimes the most powerful force in the world is simply understanding, simply compassion, simply the willingness to see another being, human or animal, not as a threat, but as someone experiencing fear." Walter was called to the stage. He walked slowly, deliberately, his aging joints protesting slightly with each step. When he reached the podium, Chief presented him with an official commendation plaque, a wooden frame with an engraved brass plate recognizing his actions and his service to the community. The crowd erupted in applause. Walter held the plaque, looking out at the assembled audience with evident emotion on his weathered face. He was not a natural public speaker, and the experience clearly made him uncomfortable, but he had insisted on saying a few words. "I appreciate this recognition," Walter began, his voice quieter than the podium's microphone ideally required, but somehow more powerful because of that quietness. "But I want to be clear about something. What I did 2 weeks ago wasn't heroic. It was simply what needed to be done in that moment. Any of you would have done the same if you had understood what I understand about animals, that they respond to fear with fear, to aggression with aggression, but to calm with calm." Walter paused, his eyes scanning the room. "I spent 6 years in the military working with dogs. I learned from those dogs something that I've carried with me for over 50 years, that discipline and love are not mutually exclusive, that understanding and strength go hand in hand, that the best partnerships, whether between soldiers and dogs or between police officers and canines, are built on genuine respect and genuine care for the other being." He looked directly at Officer, then at Duke. "Officer, your dog is exceptional, but he's exceptional not because he's been trained to respond to commands. He's exceptional because he knows that you care about him, that you see him as a partner, not as a tool. That's what I tried to communicate to Duke when he was frightened. I was communicating that same principle: I see you, I understand you, I'm here with you." And that was enough. Walter held up the plaque. "This recognition means something to me. It means that someone is listening to what I'm trying to say about the relationship between humans and animals. It means that maybe, just maybe, more handlers will start thinking about their K9 partners with this perspective. And if that happens, then something truly meaningful will have come from what was otherwise just a frightening morning in a quiet neighborhood." The applause that followed was sustained and genuine. Following the ceremony, the police department had arranged for a reception in an adjacent room. Refreshments were served, and attendees mingled informally. Walter found himself the center of attention, with officers approaching him to ask questions about his military experience and his philosophy about animal handling. But Walter insisted on taking time to speak with Officer and Duke privately. The three of them, man, officer, and dog, walked together to a quiet corner of the reception area. Duke immediately approached Walter and pressed his head against the elderly man's leg in a gesture of affection. Walter knelt down slowly, his knees creaking, and embraced the dog. "How is he?" Walter asked. "Better every day," replied. "But I think something fundamental changed in him during those moments with you. He's more relaxed, more confident. Almost like he learned that even when everything is chaotic and scary, there's always the possibility of safety." Walter nodded, his weathered face reflecting deep understanding. That's the most important lesson any creature can learn. Over the following months, Walter became an unofficial consultant to the Metro City Police Department. He began attending K-9 handler training sessions, sharing his knowledge and perspective. He worked with Captain to develop new training modules that focused on the emotional and psychological aspects of K-9 work, not just technical proficiency. Handlers who initially approached Walter with skepticism gradually came to recognize the profound wisdom embedded in his teachings. Officer and Duke visited Walter's home every Saturday afternoon without fail. What had begun as a professional consultation evolved into a genuine friendship. Walter began a small garden specifically for the dogs in the neighborhood, growing vegetables and herbs that were safe for canine consumption. Children from nearby homes would bring their pets to visit Mr. Walter, and he would spend hours teaching young people about animal behavior and the importance of treating all creatures with respect and understanding. At 82 years old, Walter discovered a new purpose. The trauma of Duke's escape, which could have ended tragically, instead became the catalyst for a new chapter in his life. He was no longer an elderly man living quietly in a suburban home. He was a teacher, a mentor, a bridge between the old wisdom he had carried from his military days and the modern practices of a police department learning to approach their work with greater humanity. Duke lived to be 13 years old, eventually retiring from active police service. Officer kept him at home during his final years, and Walter was a regular visitor, spending time with the dog that had taught him, and so many others, about the power of connection and understanding. The quiet suburban neighborhood where it all began continued to thrive. Walter's story became part of the community's identity, a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary transformations begin with something as simple as one person's willingness to respond to fear with compassion, to see danger and choose understanding instead. And on quiet Tuesday mornings, Walter would still be found in his garden, tending to his roses, greeting the dogs and children of the neighborhood with the same patient wisdom that had changed everything on that remarkable October day, when an escaped police dog and an elderly man discovered that sometimes the most powerful force in the world is simply the willingness to understand. The end.